Well, that's a great story to start the summer with, isn't it? You know, of all of the stories in the Bible, I think I hate this one the most. Certainly in the top 5. I know what you're thinking. You can't hate stories in the Bible. First of all, it's the Bible. Yes, you can. Secondly, you might have a strong dislike, but you can't hate. Hate's a strong word. Actually appropriate, though. I think. Here's why. I do strongly dislike this story for an abundance of reasons, not the least of which is God wants you to do what? But the reason I hate it, I think, is because hate comes from fear and ignorance, right? And there's some things that really scare me about this story. And there's some things I'm pretty sure, like, from anything that I know that is scaring me about this story, I'm pretty sure there's a load of stuff I probably don't either, that I don't know. I wasn't there. Anybody? No. See, the thing is, there's lots of things about this. There's lots of things that scare me about this story. First of all, if you put it in its place in the past, whether you do in the past or you find a place for it in the present or the future or whatever, when you put it in its place in the past, there are lots of things to be scary about this story. It's an ancient story, remember. Ancient story. There was a time that sacrifices weren't just animals. They were people. And there was certainly a time when the sacrifices were children. And there are some Jewish scholars who think that that's what this story is actually about. Originally, what it's really about is a way of saying, stop that. That the story, the idea that Abraham would sacrifice his son as a worthy offering to God is wrong. Clearly, because God stops it. So, stop doing that. I know, we don't want to acknowledge that, but there was a time. There was a time. There's also I think, a way to, or a perspective on the story, a way to understand the story, where it's not just about the idea that Abraham willingly sacrifices his son, hang on. Isaac is not his only son. In fact, read into the story the rest of everything that's happened so far, right? Like right from the point where God says to Abraham and Abram and Sarai, right? Way back when, go, I will take care of you. And by the way, you're going to be the father of great nations. And off they go. Remember that? Trusting in God enough that off they go. Apparently that wasn't enough. But then God says, of course, you're going to be the father of many nations. But then Abraham and Sarah don't have any children. And so Abraham has a child with Hagar, Ishmael, in order that he would have a son. He does have another son. In fact, he probably has other sons. I'm just saying. I mean, he was 100 and something. I'm just saying. But not long before this story, he sends Hagar and Ishmael off into the desert. He sends them away because he has Isaac now. We don't even really know how old Isaac is in this story. But he has Isaac now, so he doesn't need Ishmael. So off he goes. So is this some sort of retribution for that? Is it a, see, this is what it feels like, buddy, kind of story? Is it a, you didn't trust me enough, and so you had to try and manufacture your own heir kind of a story? You might want to wonder about that a little bit. Because it started out with trusting in God enough to simply leave everything behind and go. But then, or maybe Abraham was thinking that was how it was supposed to happen. After all, they were old. No offense. So does that mean there are times in your life where you have to kind of think, well, God's going to make this happen, but then there are times where you have to think, I can make this happen? What's the difference? In fact, there are also many people who think that what this story is really about is the disconnect between generations. The idea that older generations are willing to sacrifice the next generation. And God says no. And yet we do it anyway. Okay, this is a moment on your TV screen where there should be just a brief pause where you get a lovely picture while I run over to the pulpit and run back because I forgot something. What if what this story is really about is the idea that is this idea that generation to generation we need to consider the needs of the generations that are ahead as well as the generation that is now. And how often have we not? How often have we sacrificed the next generation? Not just children, but the next generation. If you're familiar with Leonard Cohen's take on this story, that's part of it. He has a brilliant poem about this story. It sounds very much like every other Leonard Cohen song, but read the poem. Very much worthwhile. That isn't the poem I want to read you, though. The one I want to read you is a short poem by Wilfred Owen. If you're not familiar with Wilfred Owen, he was a poet who wrote during the First World War. And in fact, if you're familiar with The War Requiem by Benjamin Britten, much of his poetry was used in that. It's an awesome piece. You should listen to that. But Owen wrote about the First World War. He was in service. In fact, he died. He was killed in action 11 days before the end of the war. Like less than that. It was November of 1918. And he'd written a lot of poetry about the war and about his experiences. And this is his take on the Abraham and Isaac story. It's called the parable of the old man and the young. So Abram rose and clave the wood and went and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned both of them together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. I think that's a pretty powerful piece of writing, particularly since the story doesn't always end the way it's told in Genesis, does it? If we are reading this story as a story about sacrifice, and sacrifice what it is that we are sacrificing, and God putting a stop to that sacrifice, how many times have we ignored that? The first war is just one little example. Little. Millions example. But that kind of brings the story into the moment a little bit more, doesn't it? It actually causes us to wonder about the future a little bit too. It's a different perspective on the story. There are many more, I'm pretty sure. There are many more different ways. There are many more different angles into this story. Many. Including the idea that Abraham knew. Before they even started out, Abraham knew God would provide, and he wouldn't have to kill Isaac. And there are little hints about that, telling the others that we would be back, that kind of thing. Or he could have been bluffing. We don't really know. The thing is, you have to really get into the story to find that out. The real reason that I really hate the story is because I can't get into the story. Because I can't get past the first line of this piece of the story. And God tested Abraham. I can't get into the idea that a God of love and grace and compassion tests us. I 100% am behind the idea that we test each other. And God knows, God knows, we test ourselves. Absolutely. I can't get behind the idea that God tests us. First of all, because a God of love and grace and compassion is a God of inspiration and empowerment and support, not a God of testing. And secondly, I can't get behind the idea that God is testing, that God tests us, because it makes it way too easy to say it's someone else's fault. It makes it way too easy to go, why would God do that? Or, why didn't God help me? It makes it way too easy to go, oh, third party, it's not me. See, I want to believe that a God of love and care and compassion and grace is a God who is with me always in all of the testing I do of myself, in all of the testing that we do of each other, in all of the testing that the world does. I know that God is in that world, but I also know that we have free will and we each have our own journeys. And the combination of those two things to me says our journeys are our own, and how we live together as creations of God, as part of the being of God, brings both testing and love and grace and care to each of us. And throughout all of that, God is with us. God is with us when the bad things happen. God is with us when the good things happen. God is with us when we're trying to make a choice that's difficult. Because we have to. We have to make difficult choices. Because we have choice. And God is with us in that process of finding our way to making the right choice. The correct choice? Nope. Neither of those. The good choice. The good choice. God is the inspiration and the empowerment and the encouragement. God is the support. God is the presence that encourages us to live, as Jesus teaches us to live. Jesus isn't testing us. Jesus is saying, yes, you can do this, but not testing to see whether we're going to pass or fail at it. Because we're going to fail lots. We are. And I think when we do, God is right there going, it's okay. It's okay. You're not alone in this. It's going to be okay. It's going to be better than okay. I have trouble getting past the first line. I find the rest of it really interesting. And some of those perspectives are really not just fascinating, but quite meaningful, obviously. But the idea that God tests us, God is in all things. And all of those things that have their own ability to choose, or they're simply their ability to be, creates that context of testing for us. And whether we decide we pass or fail, we're the ones who judge that. God is with us always.